Hey everybody, how you doing today? Welcome back to Coliseum Forum. And today we have uh, we have a gentleman with us who has been in the comic industry for just about ever. I think they built the DC offices around him, and he's been there ever since. Mr. Paul Levitz, former publisher, current writer, editor, and all-around gentleman, and all-around great guy for the industry. And Paul is with us today to tell us about some of the things about the early days of many of the things that we just take for granted these days. How you doing today, Paul?
I'm doing fine, Phil. Thank you very much for welcoming me on. It's a nice way to break up the day in the middle of all of this craziness.
And there's a lot of craziness going on, but we're getting through it. And luckily, we have lots of comics to read and that kind of stuff. So it could be worse. It could be worse. So just for the people who may not be familiar with you, other than a name on a masthead here and there, give us the 30 seconds. Who is Paul Levitz?
But my age, it takes a little more than 30 seconds.
We've got time. Feel free.
Born in Brooklyn, started reading comics as pretty much as soon as I could read. Started one of the early fan magazines, originally under the name Etc., then inherited the name of a older zine called The Comic Reader. It was sort of a TV guide for comics back in the day when publishers weren't telling the readers when the next issue was coming out, weren't telling the creators when their work would be published, weren't putting credits on the books. And at that point, something like 95% of all the people working on comics in America were in the New York metro area. So I got to know almost all of them as a kid. That was very cool. And one day I'm in the DC offices gathering news for the next issue, and Joe Orlando summons me into his office, says, "You want to write my letter columns, kid?" I'm not a writer, Joe. You write well enough to write a letter column. Admittedly, this is not a very high bar, but so suddenly at age 16, I'm a professional writer, if you want to count it as that. And within a couple months after that, I'm writing DC's equivalents of the bullpen page, Direct Currents, Amazing World of DC, kinds of things. And when Joe's assistant goes on vacation that next summer, taking an extended vacation, he asked me if I would like to fill in. This is a really tough question for a 16-year-old. Yes. So I'm 16. It's literally one day after I've graduated high school, and I'm on the masthead of DC Comics as an assistant editor. His assistant never came back from vacation, went on to do some wonderful things in Africa, get his PhD, and I never left. I worked in the editorial department for about 8 years, finishing up as the editor of the Batman titles, then moved over to the business side of the company, and under a bunch of different titles, became basically what in modern terms you might call the chief operating officer of the company, kind of running the business operations of the place, and finished up with about 7 years as the president and publisher, running the whole place after Jeanette Kahn went off to be a movie producer. Pardon me blowing my nose, a little bit of allergies going on.
All good. 'Tis the season.
Since I left the desk, I've been spending about a little more than half of my time teaching colleges and grad schools, occasionally doing consulting gigs for different places, writing. I've written some stuff for DC, have a series that's running with interruptions from Valiant at the moment called The Visitor, interrupted because of the virus, but just got word that they're coming back for the last 2 issues towards the end of the summer. Yay. I have a graphic novel in the Ozone at Dark Horse, tied up in the same set of things, but I assume that'll be coming before the end of the year. I serve on a couple of charitable boards, the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, a thing called Clarion Foundation, and on the board of Boom Comics, one of the mid-sized publishers. And, just do whatever weird shit entertains me.
Well, it sounds like you're being well entertained, and you've entertained us for a lot of years. Now, right there behind you on your bookshelf, I see the archive editions of Legion of Superheroes,
You do indeed.
which I believe is one of our shared loves. That Legion of Superheroes got me into comics. That was one of the first things that I read. Great story, loved it. And all these years later, you've written some of the what they've called some of the best Legion stories ever with the Great Darkness saga, and several of the others. A lot of books with Keith Giffen that you wrote at the time, which were phenomenally well done. And one of my favorite that I actually own a piece of original art on is I have a piece of Jim Starlin's art
Uh,
from the Superboy and Legion of Superheroes issue that you wrote, and Jim Starlin he drew it.
Drew it
So
and plotted it,
what's that?
and he plotted it as well.
Very cool. So, all these things that you've worked on over the years, was Legion kind of one of your first loves on that?
Oh yeah, no, Legion was the first comic I collected. I mean, I had read Superman, some Batman. Didn't read a lot of Marvel in the early days. My mom was nervous about how many comics I was reading, so she had me on a restricted diet of couldn't buy more than 3 a week, and there pretty much always were 3 DCs I really wanted to have. But I began to collect Legion very early on, and I think I just loved the multiplicity of characters, the science fiction aspects of it. I was a big science fiction reader also as a kid, and got to play with the toys a few times. And I'm astounded that people still look back and love something that I did. God, it's now almost 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And with the kind of devotion that people seem to have to Great Darkness Saga, which I enjoyed very much doing and I'm proud of, but never would have imagined it would endure this long.
It was a great series. You really knocked it out of the park on that one. You basically took all those toys and you did amazing things with them that anyone who had been a longtime Legion fan looked at it and said, this is what the Legion should be. This is everything we want out of a story like that. So
It was a little ahead of its time. We weren't yet at the period of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, cosmic warfare, cosmic crises in comics. So the scale of it worked really well. And, being able to borrow Darkseid and integrate him a little more fully into the DC universe, he was such a great character, is such a great character. And he hadn't been really used a lot since Jack had left at that point. And when you have somebody like Darkseid in there, the scale gets larger because he's a larger character. So
right.
there's a host of, the Legion archives are in front of some of my bound volumes of the Legion. There's a army of Legion action figures on the wall over there, in front of my history and nonfiction books. I'm not quite sure why they're on those shelves, but that seemed to be where they landed.
It works. So back before everything was collected into a hardback book, you were one of the first ones who I believe you started with Justice League as one of the first archive editions. Was that?
I think we started with Batman at the time of the Tim Burton Batman movies, because we were doing so well during those movies with things like Dark Knight Returns in trade paperback. It seemed clear that there was a budding book format market for these things, and Batman was our best working flavor. So I think that's where we started. But we kind of bounced between the Golden Age ones, which were a lot of work because DC hadn't kept negatives of any of that material. So it all had to, and scanning didn't exist as a comfortable technology for reproducing old comics at that point. So you had to go in and do a lot of hand retouch to make those issues work. So we kind of bounced between we'd do a Golden Age one and then we'd do a Silver Age one like Justice League that we had the negatives for. But I'm thrilled that, we were able to do, particularly my two favorite projects in that were doing the complete Spirit archives, because that material had never been properly collected,
Right.
and doing the All-Star archives, because I had been a great fan of the JSA characters. I got to write them for a little while. But the original issues for that were more expensive than I was willing to spend as a kid. My investment decisions as a young man were not particularly wise ones. I thought $130 for Action 1 was a ridiculous price to pay.
Ridiculous. Absolutely crazy to think about that.
So I ultimately ended up buying stupid things like stocks and bonds when I had a little money.
What were you thinking?
Would have been much better off buying more comic books, but
do you still have a comic book collection today?
I have about 40,000 comics, all bound. So they're not probably as valuable as they would have been if I had focused on preserving value. But they're so much easier to read and so much pleasanter in the bound volumes. It was an odd hobby. There was when the bound volumes would come back every year, I'd have to rearrange the books in my library to keep them all in order to put the new bound volumes in the right places. My older boy, who was emotionally born about 150 years old, very serious soul, decided one day to humor Dad and help him with this whole project of moving everything in the library. He did it for about half hour, whatever, and then turned around to me. I think he was 10 at the time, and said, "Dad, how much have you spent binding your comics?" I said, "Well, Philip, you took estimating in school. Figure it out. I don't know, they're about $20 a volume."
Right.
So he took the pocket calculator out of the desk and started looking around the library and punching numbers and punched all and said, "Dad, you spent $25,000 binding your comics? Boy, you're a schmuck." I said, "The money's put away for your college. Don't worry about it."
And now DC does everything in bound volumes. Everything comes out in hardback, it seems, these days, and it makes it so much easier, but it's a different market.
When we started doing things like the archives and the hardcovers, one of my favorite moments was, I'm not sure where we were at the moment that this happened, but Frank Miller turning to me and saying, when those archives started coming out, I just flashed back to those bound volumes you had on your shelf when we used to go over for the poker games. I said, "I know where this comes from." I'm not sure that was exactly the case, but I'm certainly happy to have good quality editions of the great stuff out there.
It's really nice stuff. Now, under your watch, we also saw the first statues that came out. And I remember when the Sandman, which was the first one, I believe, was solicited. And I looked at this and I thought, all right, Sandman's kind of this up and coming character. He's kind of a hot character from Neil Gaiman's Sandman. But who in their right mind is going to pay $89 for a statue? $89? Are they out of their minds? And the statue came out. I ordered one because I felt like I should have at least one in the store, even though I was convinced it was going to be a fixture, 30 years later.
It'd be a pretty fixture.
Next thing you know, it comes out and everybody wants one. We couldn't believe the demand for these statues, which of course launched an entire industry. And I was looking at a new Batman that I have in the store now from Sideshow, and it's a $1,500 3-foot tall Batman figure. It's gorgeous, but it's certainly not $89. So,
does it come with a Batmobile that you can drive in or something?
You'd think so. But
let me tell you the story behind that moment, because really you represent a piece of that story, whether you know it or not. So we had launched, you as a retailer back in the day, we had launched Sandman. Neil was not a name in those days. He was a beginning writer. He'd done Black Orchid. couple of different things that had seen printed in small presses or the UK, but not anything that was legendary yet. And the first few issues of Sandman weren't the most accessible. They relied heavily on pre-existing DC mythology. Neil hadn't really hit his full stride yet. We were coming up on the 8th issue. It was getting some momentum. Sales were going up a little bit issue by issue, which was very rare to see things, what I call a J-hook pattern, right? And Bruce Bristow, who was our head of marketing in those years, came up with this idea that what we needed to do was to get the retailers to pay attention. Because, you know, it's insane now with the number of products that are offered every month. But even in, I guess this would be 1990, the number of things being offered were far more than any retailer could really spend time analyzing and thinking through. And we were in a pre-computer era, so you didn't even have good tools to work with for any data you might have of what paths and patterns we're working with. You were talking about putting in a new point of sale system. Nobody in comics had heard of what point of sale was in 1990. Carol Kalish was still running around trying to get people to use cash registers.
Right.
So Bruce said, what we have to do is we have to make Sandman into an event. And he came up with the idea of doing a Sandman month, which would have 2 or 3 different products available. We'd give away a certain number of free issues of the next issue. I think it was free. Because we thought 8 would be a good entry point. And he said, you know, and the thing that will really force them to pay attention is that they're going to have to figure out how many of this, you remembered as $89. I don't remember the price exactly, but this really expensive, beautiful statue, they're going to have to think about Sandman a lot, and they're going to have to look at their numbers to figure that out.
Right.
They'll probably get it wrong, but hopefully they'll get it wrong by ordering not enough. And then that'll demonstrate that we've got something exciting going on. And if it had happened in an eBay era, you would have seen that statue immediately jump up to probably $200 or $300. But even without eBay, it was still a trading volume and sort of a buzz of what was going on. And I think it did its job.
Yeah, I know that they were selling at conventions for $100 to $150 the following month. So it definitely got some attention. And I guess Randy Bone, then the next ones he did for you was Batman.
He did a Batman. I think he did a Swamp Thing around the same era.
And he did a Lobo.
Yeah, he did a beautiful Lobo.
But Lobo was such an odd choice to do at the time. I guess he was a hot character for the time being, but it's like, we got a Lobo before we got a Superman. And that's something that was always a little bit bizarre to me, the ordering on that.
Well, you know, part of it, there were other Superman objects you could have.
Yeah.
One of the things that made the Sandman statue special or the Lobo statue special, I remember ordering from Marvel Mania, the old Marvel fan club. They had a set of plastic sort of blow molded, I think there was 6 figures, an Iron Man, a Thor, probably a Cap. I don't remember who all of them were. I don't remember there being a Fantastic Four member as part of it. And they were all gray, not painted, not an interesting color. They weren't brilliantly sculpted, but boy, was that exciting. This was the first time I could have, and obviously I didn't know the term shelf art, or maybe the term didn't exist in those days, but it was the first time I could have some shelf art, some physical representation of these characters I love.
Right.
And when you're doing something with a character that people already care about, but they don't have the ability to possess in a new form, then I think that's a really exciting moment. And, you know, a lot of what what we tried to do in so many decisions at DC in my tenure was influenced by the several of us around the table who were fans. I remember one staff meeting. I don't remember what the subject of it was. Might have been to figure out what our next set of trade paperbacks or hardcovers were. And there were 5 or 6 of us around the table. One of them was a woman named Terry Cunningham, who was the managing editor under various titles for a lot of years. Terry was not a comic fan. She had come in from the outside. Very wonderfully decent human being who became sort of a mother hen to a lot of what went on and was responsible for a lot of the administrative aspects of editorial for many, many years before she retired when they moved to California. And we got in some conversation about which books we were okaying and whether we had them in our collection or they were scarce. And she just sort of sighed at one moment and said, God, and I bet half of you have lists in your wallet of which books you need.
She underestimated.
And Bob Greenberger and I and whoever else was in the room just reached in our wallet and pulled out our little want lists. And she just put her head in her hands, kind of moaning and groaning about all these overage adolescents that she was working with. But the fact that we still cared that way, I think, made a difference in the material. It didn't mean we could always put out what we wanted to. I mean, Bob Wayne and I argued for, I think about it, excuse me, let me kill that phone. For about a decade over putting out a Sugar and Spike archive, because we both loved Sugar and Spike, we both respected it. And I was a good friend to Shelley Mayer in his later years, but I couldn't sign off on it. I couldn't see an analysis that could argue that we could actually make $1 of profit, much less a reasonable profit margin on it. And Bob just kept trying. And eventually, after I was gone, he managed to win, thankfully. So I've got one on my shelf. But
did you make a profit?
I don't know. It was after I left.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
I hope they did. They didn't make enough of a profit that they did any more of them. So I don't think it was a tremendous winner. But
it's on the shelf now. So there you go.
On the shelf.
Yeah.
And now, Shelley would be smiling. He'd be confused, but he'd be smiling.
So things are very different, say 30 years ago, between Marvel and DC. It seemed like everybody knew each other in that era, whereas everyone seems spread out now, and the only time they get together is conventions, which obviously there's a lot of. But it seemed like, was there as much of a us versus them as it seemed like, or was it more of a everybody in the same room just enjoying the back and forth?
Well, it was a very small business. And if it was us against them, it was the us of the comic book people against the outside world. We were the unloved puppies. We were the odd kids on the block. And was there competition? Sure, occasionally. Usually over the hiring of some writer or artist in the process. But most of us were just friends. I mean, the regular poker game I played in for years, the regulars in the game, we're talking the late 1970s, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Jim Shooter, Tom DeFalco, Denny O'Neil, Marty Pasco, Mike Barr, Roger Slifer, Jack Abel. Once in a while, you'd have Roger McKenzie was regular for a good bunch of years. Once in a while, Frank Miller would show up. Once in a long while, Chris Claremont would show up. Once or twice only, Jeanette Kahn would pop in. She wasn't much of a poker player. Wasn't her game of choice.
That's quite a who's who of the industry at the time, though. So.
Well, and in terms of who would be who,
Right.
You know, you've really covered off a generation of the creative leadership of the team.
Right.
And, you know, we would go out to dinner beforehand, most of us, and play penny ante, literally nickel and dime games. We'd talk about comics. We'd look at each other's work. We'd learn from each other. We'd talk about what shape comics could eventually become. And there were volleyball games. There were baseball games. Different crowds. Those were the more athletic kids. But it was a bunch of really nice people. And you also have to understand that in those years, you didn't go into comics because you could make a lot of money, because you couldn't. You didn't go into it because you could become famous, because nobody had. And you certainly didn't go into it because this was going to improve your sex life, because there were either no or virtually no young women around the business, and certainly no young women hanging around it with the kind of attitudes that, say, hung around rock performers. So you weren't going to get sex, you weren't going to get famous, you weren't going to get money. Your only motivation for being there was you really wanted to do this thing. And we all did. So we had a lot in common. We're all foolish together.
But it was a great business to be foolish in, so that's kind of cool. Well,
A lot of people.
So you started writing at the age of 16. What was the first actual comic story that you did?
I think the genuine comic story, first thing I did was probably at 17, was a mystery story for Weird Mystery Tales, Drive-In Death. There was a McDonald's on my corner, which had actually been a significant improvement in the local cuisine in Brooklyn when it first opened in the probably around 1970, 71. And I think I used the occasion to make fun of that whole world. I did a few mystery stories, and then got to do Phantom Stranger for a couple of issues. Got to do launch Karate Kid in his own book. Got to do a few Aquaman stories. Then there was a little fallow period. Carmine Infantino, who was running the company, thought I really wasn't ready to be doing that much work yet. He was probably right. And when he left, I started writing again. And at that point, I went back on Aquaman and inherited Justice Society when Jerry Conway left to go be editor-in-chief of Marvel for 3 weeks. And a little bit after that, ended up getting the Legion.
So Karate Kid was the first Legion book you actually wrote.
Yeah.
And then you eventually ended up killing him off in the Baxter series at the time, which made the fan base go absolutely loopy about how could you do this? What was the blowback to that at the time, and why did you kill him off?
For whatever reason, Keith Giffen, who was drawing the Legion and kibitzing on the plots in those years, really didn't like Karate Kid. I don't know whether he didn't like doing the homework to figure out a plausible looking karate pose. Can I jump out for 2 minutes? Sorry, I've got to try and take this.
Go ahead. Well, for those of you who are still watching, I don't know how interesting I can be for a few minutes because I'm certainly not Paul, but during those eras of the Legion of Superheroes, it was one of the top selling books that we had when he was working with Keith Giffen. It became so popular that they launched the Baxter series with that and Marv Wolfman and George Perez's Teen Titans, which turned out to be some of their top sellers at the time. They came out with what was known as the Baxter series because these were on a higher quality paper. Instead of being 75 cents or $1, they came out at $1.25 and then $1.50. Wouldn't it be great to have those again? But these were supposedly higher end series, broader stories in a lot of way, nicer artwork because they were printed on a better paper that would absorb that better. So those were our top selling books at the time. The only thing that was coming close was X-Men. X-Men was doing great. Spider-Man, of course, was always doing well in those days. But everybody was collecting Legion of Superheroes because the Keith Giffen artwork took it to a different level, and Paul's stories brought in a very wide universe that came across very well as far as the future went. So those are the eras from the trenches of the comic book store of what we would do in those days in ordering them, and everyone would talk about them. Everyone was excited about them. So that was the brief history of the Legion of Superheroes in that era from the comic store perspective. But Paul's back and is more interesting than I am. So,
well, just less frequently talking to your audience. I don't know about more interesting, but okay. Sorry.
So you killed off Karate Kid.
Everybody. So Keith really wanted to kill him. You know, the blowback. I mean, there were a lot of people who were disappointed. I liked the character. I mean, he wouldn't have been my favorite Legionnaire to launch a solo comic of, but you know, back in, I guess it was 75, Marvel was probably doing well with Master of Kung Fu, and there was a lot of, maybe the Kung Fu movies were out and hot, and Carmine wanted to jump on the trend. And usually what happened in those years is he would walk down the hall at DC. We only had really one hall. So the company only had about 30 people working for him in those days. And he'd poke his head into a couple of different editors' offices and he'd say, you have to do a martial arts book. You're 2 months late. And he assigned one to Joe Orlando. He assigned one to Denny O'Neil. Denny came up with Richard Dragon. Joe said, I don't know, what can we do? And I said, well, you know, the company does have a martial arts character. We could do him. That was difficult politics because the way DC worked in those days, every editor owned their set of characters, and Murray Boltinoff was the editor on Legion of Superheroes, so he had control over those characters. But I explained to Joe who Karate Kid was and what we could do with him. We could bring him into the 20th century, separate him from the Legion, do this or that. And Joe thought it wasn't a bad idea, and he went down and pitched it to Carmine. Carmine said okay and squared it with Murray, who grumped a little bit, understandably.
Yeah.
And we were off to the races.
Very cool. Well, one of the early things that you worked on, and this is an amazing series, amazing in the sense that I believe you were 17 years old at the time when you got to work with Steve Ditko and Wally Wood on a book called Stalker, which went 3 issues and then, oddly enough, got a 4th issue after the fact almost. So what was the story behind that?
So again, this was another case of let's get into this genre. Conan was working for Marvel, and Carmine needed to add titles to the schedule for whatever business reason. He came back from corporate budget meeting and walked down the hall and said, you need to do a sword and sorcery book. You need to do a sword and sorcery book, and you're 2 months late. And I guess Joe needed to do 2. And, you know, I'm a budding writer. I haven't got great assignments yet. I liked sword and sorcery as a category. I'd read all the Conan books. I loved Michael Moorcock. I'd read almost all of his stuff by that time. A lot of the other junkier sword and sorcery books. Loved what Roy was doing on Conan. And, you know, me, please. So Joe turned to David Michelinie, who was another one of his young writers, and gave David a shot at developing something. And David came in with the premise for Claw. And I had a shot, and I came in with a premise for Stalker. A lot of it was very Michael Moorcock derivative. I think it was a relatively original premise, and the idea that a guy could sell his soul and lose it and still be alive. Had no idea who was going to draw it. And I lucked out to get Steve and Woody, which is ridiculous for a 17-year-old kid to get. And we're doing issues. Carmine was not, I think, an enormous fan of either Ditko or Wood as artists. He knew that they were respected and that they were successful artists and that they were good artists, but I don't think he particularly believed, maybe at that moment in their career, that they were the most commercial. And he certainly thought I was, at best, an apprentice writer. Reasonable decision. So he canceled it after 3 issues. Mm-hmm. He canceled it early enough in the production process that I was able to write the 3rd issue with a sort of semi-neat little ending. In those days, before computers, before word processing, production schedules were hand typed. And Carmine's assistant was a very sweet, very young woman named Shelley Abramson at that point. And Shelley went to type the next production schedule and accidentally typed in a 4th issue for Stalker. And Carmine looked at it. I don't know what the conversation was between the two of them, but the decision was sort of, oh, the hell with it. Let them do a 4th issue. It's too much work to get you to do a new production schedule and to do a new memo. So we got to do a 4th issue, and I had to come up with yet another semi-neat little ending to the end of it. But I'm really glad we got to do the 4th issue. I'm not complaining.
Today it would have been a delete and off it goes, and that would have been it.
I think I would have been deleted before the issue would have been, but yes, absolutely.
So we're in the age right now. You're in New York. I'm in Florida. We're talking over Zoom. We're streaming it live to Facebook. People from all over the nation can watch us. The weird thing is, in the days of comics when you were creating them in New York, we didn't have this. We didn't have anything close to this. People wrote comics and drew comics without ever meeting their collaborators face to face, sometimes for decades at a time. So how did you do comics in that era? I mean, did you sit down with Steve Ditko and Wally Wood? Did you do everything through the mail? How did it work in those days?
So, I mean, you're absolutely right that technologically it was totally different. We didn't even have Federal Express. You know, one of the reasons why people who weren't living in New York weren't able to get work is the company didn't really trust the post office to deliver the art smoothly. It was less a problem with the writers because you might have a carbon, or you might have gone to the store and had a Xerox made. It would be the same difference. But for the artists, particularly, you know, if you were Jack Kirby, okay, but you know, if you were just an ordinary working guy, they wanted you to bring in your pages by hand. The writers and artists didn't work face to face, often didn't know who they were, even if they were both living in the same neighborhood. They weren't encouraged to. It wasn't a natural thing. It depended on the book. I mean, if you had a couple of guys of my generation working on something, we probably knew each other, in one way or another, we'd start conversations. But if you were the old school guys, you know, if you were Jim Aparo, I worked with Jim on Aquaman, for example. I'd bring in a script, Joe Orlando would edit it, we'd mail it to Jim. A month later, Jim's pages would arrive in a neatly wrapped brown paper package from the US Postal Service. Jim often didn't get to do covers on the books in those days because he didn't like coming into the office, and Carmine liked working with the cover artists in person. I don't remember having a single conversation about the material. other than, thanks, and this is when you need the next script and it'll be ready for you, or I'm mailing the check out. It The older world of comics that was fading away at the time was a very impersonal world. This was a job. It beat the hell out of garment work or physical work, but you were working for a living, creating a creative product, and you turned it in and you got paid, and that was great. And maybe you'd get mailed copies of the book when it came out, or maybe you would pick up copies if you happened to see them in the office. But most of the older professionals didn't bother keeping copies of what they had written, much less reference copies. So if Bob Kanigher contradicted himself 3 issues apart on Wonder Woman, giving her, different details of an origin or different details of something else, it was probably because he wasn't even looking at the back copies of it. As opposed to my generation, who would, make rigorous notes of every little fan detail. Even if we weren't Mark Grunwald, we were trying to be Mark Grunwald in terms of keeping track of stuff.
Nice. So you worked with a lot of different editors, and everyone talks about what a great editor Archie Goodwin was, or Denny O'Neil. Did you work with these guys? Did you enjoy working with these guys?
Well, I worked with them all in different capacities. I never wrote for Archie. He left DC for the first time before I started freelance writing. I was doing letter pages, but not comic stories. And when he came back, it was after I had really stopped writing I stopped writing for about 20 years when my kids were young, because I wanted the weekends to hang out with them. But I worked with him, of course, in the office and got to know him well. Archie's an interesting case because for almost any other editor that I spent time with, I can talk about some of their techniques that they did well that I learned from. Archie's technique, besides that he was a really talented writer and understood art as a good cartoonist himself, though not a illustrative cartoonist in the way that superhero comics would be.
Right.
His technique was just, he was an incredibly nice human being. And he managed to coax the best work out of most of the people he worked with. And never could figure out the fingerprints on the process. Denny was a hard, solid, almost journalistic editor. He taught me a lot. One of my problems as a young writer, which you may be able to see just listening to me, is I often speak in long sentences. And I kind of ramble a little bit. And my characters were doing that. And Denny taught me how to apply some journalistic copy editing techniques to the fictional dialogue I was writing to make the dialogue tighter and better. Mm-hmm. Each editor taught you something different in the process, if you looked and you listened, because everybody used a somewhat different bag of tricks. And hopefully you tried to steal tricks from all of them to add to your bag.
Very nice. All right. You've been around this industry almost longer than most people who are in the industry these days. You've got to have some favorite stories about convention experiences or something else that you could tell on a family-friendly production. What's one of your favorite stories of old?
I think one of my favorite moments was when we were doing the DC superhero stamps for the Postal Service. Mm-hmm. And we were going to launch them at San Diego Con. They made a big event of it. I don't remember whether it was our money or the Postal Service's money that fueled the event, but we had most of the artists whose work was represented on the stamps. And that was a lot of great Golden Agers and a lot of Silver Agers and a lot of the modern artists, all gathered, or their families. We threw a little I don't remember whether it was a breakfast or lunch before the event. And one of the moments at that I really loved was overhearing a conversation between Carmine and Jim Lee, who hadn't known each other previously. And each of them was basically asking the other, what's it like to be the best artist in the business, or a top artist in the business in your time? And they were kind of comparing notes across that time machine, which was just beautiful. The other moment that I really loved was watching Joe Giella stand up, because we gave each of the guys, a minute or two to speak at it. And Joe's a lovely, lovely human being. And he just got up there all sheepish. And this is just the best thing that ever happened to me, except for my wife. And there was so much love in that moment. And it was just absolutely beautiful and cute. He's a charming man. So
Great.
that was one of the better moments I've ever had at a Comic-Con.
Well, I'm glad you had some good moments, because there's definitely been some difficult moments while you're a publisher. There's been strange moments, there's been fun moments, but all in all, it sounds like you've had quite an amazing career along the way and had some fun doing it.
I've been insanely lucky. I mean, it's like being a baseball fan as a kid and growing up to manage the Yankees. I was never the best writer in the business. I was a solid commercial writer. Legion, when I was doing it in the 80s, was one of DC's best-selling books, certainly one of the Field's best-selling books. But I can't compare myself to an Alan Moore or a Neil Gaiman in terms of the creative impact they had on the field, or Chris Claremont in terms of both the creative and commercial impact that he had, much less Stan Roy back in the day. But I was a good yeoman. But in running the shop, I got to work with amazing people for decades. And, there'd be my assistant, Linda, who worked with me for a couple of decades, would keep a legal pad with calls I had to return by the desk, so I could look at it and see what I wanted to deal with and what I wanted to dodge. And I remember going out one day and looking at it, it was Chris Nolan and Neil Adams and Neil Gaiman that day, and I forget who else. And I just sort of smacked myself across the cheek and said, shut up about whatever you're complaining about. Your inner 14-year-old would have promised the devil his soul to get a chance to talk to one of these guys.
Yeah.
And they're all waiting for you to call them back. It was one of the great jobs on the planet, probably the best job I was remotely qualified for. There were things about it that were rough days, as you say, and I didn't like 50 nights a year in hotel rooms, traveling comic conventions or business trips. But overall, I was insanely lucky. I got to do something I loved. I got to make a very, very good living off it. I got to meet all of these really wonderfully strange and talented people and play with them. It's about as good as life can get.
Sounds like a good life, and you definitely left some big boots and some fingerprints all over this industry. So, believe me, your tenure at DC was some very good years, and as a retailer, I appreciate it, and as a fan, I appreciated it. So, thank you much for all your dedication, and I love the fact that you had that list of books you needed in your wallet, along with the rest of the people in the room. That's the passion that I love about this industry. So.
It was part of what kept it fun. I mean, I tried to keep adding a little something to my collection every year. Not a lot, 5 or 6 odd DCs or something that I had never collected. Let me get all the issues of Mademoiselle Marie appearing, I think was the last project I was working on that I didn't finish. But it gave me an excuse to look through the long boxes and just connect to who I was.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming in today, Paul. It's much appreciated, and we'd love to have you back at one of these times, because you've got some great stories. And I know that we only touched the tip of the iceberg on these. So,
My pleasure. Happy to come back and chat sometime. Take
all
care
right.
of yourself. And thanks for all the effort selling this stuff.
Ah, all
You know,
right.
doesn't matter if we write them if you don't connect them to the readers.
Well, and the readers are out there and they're still appreciating a lot of these books. So thanks for
Good
doing
deal.
it. And we'll be in touch.
Take
All right.
care.
Take care.